There's a great deal of prejudice out there among Protestant Christians against the writings that make up the collection we call the Old Testament Apocrypha. As Protestants, however, we should consider closely the positive value that Martin Luther, the father of the Protestant Reformation, set on these writings himself. Yes, when he published his German Bible, he separated these books out from the Old Testament and placed them in a section between the two testaments of the scriptures he considered canonical. But what does it tell us that Luther himself took the considerable trouble to translate these books into German in the first place, and to promote them among his Protestant readership by publishing them in his Bible and thus keeping them broadly accessible? In his preface to the Apocrypha, Luther says of them that, quote, "These are books that, though not esteemed like the Holy Scriptures, are still both useful and good to read." Useful and good to read, Martin Luther. I wouldn't mind having that endorsement on the back cover of any of my own books. And in his introduction to the Wisdom of Solomon, one of the more influential of the Apocrypha over the course of Christian history, Luther writes, quote, "There are many good things in it, and it is well worth reading. This book is a good exposition and example of the first commandment, and that is the main reason why this book is to be read, so that one may learn to fear and trust God, so that he may help us by his grace." Similarly, Luther commends 1 Maccabees to us with high praise. Quote, "Its words and discourses are almost as enlightening as those of the other books of Holy Scripture, and it would not have been wrong to count it as such, because it is a very necessary and useful book, as witnessed the prophet Daniel in the 11th chapter. For this reason, it is useful for us Christians also to read and know it." It was never Luther's intent that these books should disappear from our collection of treasured resources, just that they not be accorded equal authority with the undisputed books of the canon. I'll just throw out there that the King James Version was created with an Apocrypha as well, placed in between the Old and New Testaments, but carefully translated and remaining quite accessible. And it is indeed there, in between the Testaments, that these writings have the greatest value for Protestant Christians, for they bear eloquent witness to the faith, the history, the challenges, and the developments in Jewish theology and ethics between the Testaments and into the first century. The Apocrypha are indispensable if we wish to know about the Judaism into which Jesus was born and from which the early church was born. For it is not merely the Judaism of the Old Testament, but a Judaism that continued vibrantly to grow and develop in the Persian, Greek, and Roman periods. The influence of these texts on Jesus, Paul, James, and other New Testament voices is evident to all who open up the Apocrypha. The wisdom of Ben Sira and Tobit, which were written in Hebrew some 2 centuries before Jesus' birth, introduced ethical ideals that would find their way into Jesus' own teachings. Ben Sira first taught the necessity of forgiving our neighbors if we hope to experience God's forgiveness. Both Ben Sira and Tobit promote almsgiving as the investment, the way to lay up a treasure that also brings the greatest return for the giver. If we only read the Protestant Old Testament and the Protestant New Testament, we will not appreciate how deeply rooted Jesus' teachings are in the Judaism of his day. The writings of the Apocrypha contribute not only to the ethical teaching of the New Testament, but also to its theological reflection. Wisdom of Solomon, with its praise of the figure of wisdom as the, quote, "exact representation of God's being and image of God's goodness, and as the radiance emitted by God's own light," gave early Christians a language for speaking about the relationship of the Son to the Father, such as we find in the opening chapters of Colossians and Hebrews. Second Maccabees includes extensive reflections on the Jewish martyrs who died under torture for the sake of remaining loyal to the covenant, and whose steadfast obedience unto death was remembered to have turned aside God's wrath from a disobedient Israel. This, in turn, provided raw materials for early Christian reflection on the significance of Jesus' death as well as the hope of the resurrection from the dead for God's persecuted righteous ones. Disproportionate attention is given to the few theologically questionable ideas found scattered among some of the apocryphal books, leading many never to explore the significant debt that Orthodox Christian theology owes to these books alongside the books of undisputed canonical authority. As the Church moved from the apostolic period through the Nicene period, the Apocrypha continued to provide resources for the formulation of core Christian doctrines, such as the relationship of persons in the Trinity, resources for perseverance in the face of the centuries of Roman persecution, and resources for ethical guidance. After the books of the Protestant canon, the Apocrypha remains the most important resource for all Christians who want to understand the environment of Jesus and the early church and acquaint themselves with the additional texts that exercised significant formative influences upon our shared Christian heritage.